Following the Great Depression and the Second World War, Canada became a global food powerhouse. In the food industry, more products were flooding the North American market. The war industries had developed manufacturing and increased potential, which then benefited the food industry after the war. The Canadian economy grew more and benefited from the war and war industries. After World War II, Canada experienced a period of economic prosperity known as the post-war boom. This was especially true in southwestern Ontario, with its rich agricultural land. The region saw an expansion of agricultural activities, supported by government policies aimed at boosting food production. The introduction of the Veterans Act in 1942 allowed returning soldiers to purchase, and at favorable rates, land which contributed to the increase in the number of farms in the region. Many veterans chose to settle in southwestern Ontario, attracted by the opportunity to build a new life in agriculture. This influx of new farmers, coupled with the availability of affordable land, helped to expand the agricultural landscape in the region. Today, Canada is now the 8th largest exporter of food, shipping products to over 200 other nations around the world. Presently, it exports over $90 billion worth of food annually. It's an amazing accomplishment considering that only 7% of the land in Canada is used for agricultural growing. Ontario has been fundamental to that success. The province grows 20 million tons of food every year, and southwestern Ontario contributes approximately 60 to 70% of all of that food. We have been a domestic and global food heavyweight. Well, then how do you explain this, or this? How is it in a country that has such an abundant supply of food in which we ship to the rest of the world in abundance, and also which is a huge part of our domestic economy here in Canada? How can it be that with all of that going on, the Statistics Canada has now reported that 8.7 million Canadians are now food insecure, and that includes 2.1 million children? How can it be 1 in 4 Canadians are saying that they are feeling food insecure? And 50% of Canadians in a recent poll said that they're not quite sure where their next meal is going to come from. There's a lot of that going on across the provinces. In fact, here in Ontario, Feed Ontario, which is the amalgamation of all the different food banks in the province, announced that for the first time ever in its history, over 1 million people visited food banks in Ontario last year. In this series, we're going to consider what happened to Canada to put us in this position, all this wealth, all this poverty, all within the same country. It's going to be about food insecurity, which we're seeing a lot of these days, families that can't afford or get access to food. And then we want to arrive at the point of food security, where we discuss how is it that we can make it so that we can grow food locally, so that people have access to that food, and that food is affordable for every Canadian, which is something that we all wish. But before we do that, I just want us to consider something that happened in politics recently. It just happened in the House of Commons, and I was a little moved by it, so I decided to do a little video that I sent to the leader of the Canadian opposition in the Parliament of Canada, Pierre Poilievre, somebody that I know and somebody that I was trying to reach out to. But it'll help you understand that this is not a current problem. The problem for food banks and why food banks have grown so much actually has taken place over 4 decades. Have a look at this. I noticed on Twitter or X today that Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has talked about the recent food bank report that talked about how over 1 million Ontarians frequented food banks over the course of this past year. And the conclusion he drew was, the Liberals and the NDP coalition it's their fault. They've been together, for 5 years, and they've allowed all of this to happen. And I think for all of us who are in food banking at all, or even helping people who have been disadvantaged or people who are living on the margins, That's a pretty hard thing to take. It's the easiest thing to do. We see it south of the border and we see it elsewhere. But I think we all have to realize that this has been a cumulative mistake over many governments over a long period of time. Let me give you something of an example. Food banks were first started in the mid 1980s when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister. It's a long time ago. Then John Chrétien became Prime Minister and food bank use went up. Paul Martin became the next Prime Minister and food bank use went up even higher. And then came Stephen Harper, who had a number of years in Parliament, and one of his key people was Pierre Poilievre. And during those years, food bank use went up almost 40% during that time that the Conservatives were in power. And then, of course, now we have Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, and food bank use has gone up again. So over that cumulative period of time, food banks are getting closer and closer and closer to the point where they're not going to be able to meet the demand because the demands are so great. It's amazing, the Food Banks Canada had a hunger count report that it put out in 2014. So this was near the end of the Conservative and Stephen Harper's reign as the government of Canada. And it concluded that there were 841,191 people that frequented food banks in that past year. So that was 2014. 10 years later, now 2024, 1.2 million Ontarians have gone to food banks. It continues to get worse. And during that time when the Harper government was there, many groups were asked them to put in certain programs that would help these people who really needed help. It went much farther than just allowing social assistance. It talked about apprenticeships, help for people to get to work, people who were disabled, helping them to keep in the workplace. I mean, there was just a lot of different things that went on. And one of the big things that went on during those years, especially in 2007 and 2008, was that the government needed to invest in housing, affordable housing as well. And the Harper government will tell you that they did that, just as the Trudeau government will tell you that they did that, and the Chrétien and the Martin and the Mulroney government did. I have no doubt that they did. But they had to know that none of those things were sufficient. This is a cumulative Canadian dilemma. And when we see politics and political parties take these things and use all of these struggling families that are seeking help and using them as political fodder to go after the other parties, we as food banks and we as Canadians have to stand up against that. I mean, it's not because it was all Justin Trudeau's fault. Much of it is. I would remind you what Justin Trudeau said just before the election. He was a leader of the Liberals, but was not yet Prime Minister. And just before that time, he called on Stephen Harper to do a much better job at helping people who were having to come to food banks and people that were needing housing, people who had disabilities, and people who were having trouble about work. He called them in similar kind of language. Everybody does it. It happens all the time. But we're using our most vulnerable as powder that we then put in the can and then shoot the other party. That's not what it's supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about that Canada is getting progressively better. We talk about how in our legislations we're getting progressively better. We talk about as a nation how we are progressively becoming wealthier. So I've said this many times before, but I'll say it again. Canada's wealthiest year was 2019, when for the first time ever its GDP hit $2 trillion. So yes, there has been social legislation passed that was progressive and opened the doors to many communities. Yes, the economy has grown, and many of Canada's wealthiest people are far wealthier than they were just a decade ago. But for the middle class or for the people that are struggling, those things aren't the case. Things are not developing. They cannot afford housing. And now we know they're having trouble affording food. They're having trouble just getting by in this country, even though things are supposedly getting better. Well, they are not. And the fact they are not is not the fault of any one particular government or one particular leader. It's all about the idea of progressing so that even our economies themselves become something which helps the average Canadian do better and get on with their lives and are able to feed their kids. Look, I was an MP for a number of years. I know you know that. And this was during the time that Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. Now, this was in 2006 until 2011. And during that time, I was part of the Poverty Committee, I was part of the Status of Women Committee, and we would always bring up these things about how government needs to invest in these different programs that will help people. But we were also very much aware that when our own party was in power, we really didn't do that either. So we too use that as political fodder. Now, I did my best not to do that because from being in food banks now for my 39th year now, I understood that it was a cumulative problem and it was all the way across the board. And it wasn't just a federal problem and their lack of action, it was also at the provincial level. But during that time I was there, I would sit in the House of Commons and I would look over at Pierre Poilievre, and he would voice things that could sometimes be highly controversial. And I never had a harsh word with him. He never did with me either. We would sometimes see one another on the bus on the way back to Parliament. Our offices were in the same building close by with one another. We disagreed probably on just about everything. At the same time, I really felt that there was no answer and no solution to me getting up and speaking at a press conference about how terrible the Conservatives were or how terrible Pierre Poilievre was. Because we all had mud in our hands. We all had stains from the past where we did not do what we said that we would do. Food bank use soared during the Harper years. And it's soaring again now due to the Trudeau years. It got going during the Mulroney years, and it really picked up steam during the Chrétien and Martin years. This is a really Canadian problem, a cross-party problem. And we have to do something about it. And to Pierre Poilievre, I would just say, I knew you. I worked with you. We would talk briefly at times with one another. We didn't know one another all that well. But you must know better than this. If you really care about Canadians, stop using them as this fodder so that you can win power. Somehow we have to develop this ability that what's across Canada, a pan-Canada problem, requires a pan-Canada kind of solution. And for that to happen, political jurisdictions have to work together. So let me put it this way. Do you think that for the millions of kids in Canada, and there are millions of them, that are food insecure, do you think you could put together a package in working with the present government and perhaps even the provincial governments that would get those kids out of poverty? Do you? When it comes to housing, instead of criticizing the government's policies or whatever, could you maybe put forward ideas and then work with the government to make those things work? And it's very important to say right now, we can talk to any political party and they will say that they put their solutions out there. One, that's not true. The solutions, we're still waiting for the solutions from Mr. Poilievre and others about food banks and what they're going to do about rising food insecurity. But two, and this is important, they're never designed for solutions. They're designed to get votes. And then once those votes are acquired, you get on with the business of what you're doing. Well, that business needs to be hungry kids. That business needs to be families that now can no longer afford to put food in the fridge. And many of these are families that are working. You know it and I know it. But to us, to the people at the food banks, to the people who are coming to us for help, this is gut-wrenching. This is the kind of thing that we're watching mushroom like crazy, and we're seeing all of these people, many of them people that we know, many of them people that volunteered or donated to the food bank. And now here they are trying to feed their kids. That's what we face. And you look at us as though we're a public policy thing to be thrown out there, that we're a bit of political stuff that can be used to try to bring down the other party. We're Canadians. All of us are. We have been well known for our social progressivism and for our fair economics over the decades. That is not true anymore. It was Brian Mulroney that said near the end of his tenure, that the cost of leadership really isn't one of words and having to come up with words. Just lead. And he said that about the environment, but it's true about everything in politics. Just lead. If you really think that the other party doesn't have their act together, stand up in the House of Commons and demand an all-party resolution that we work on this. Now, I would remind you, and I was there when that was done a couple of decades ago, and all of Parliament stood up and said they would end child poverty by the year 2000. You know what the numbers are now. They've mushroomed. They're bigger than ever. So, yes, you could stand up in the House of Commons and say those things. And yes, it might get you some votes, or yes, it might get people calling you hypocrites. But the one thing it won't do is fix the problem. If you're going to stand up in the House of Commons and you're going to do that with the various committees, then do it. Put forward the solutions. And if you're not sure what they are, there are many food bank people that would be glad to come down in Ottawa to talk to you. There are many economists who've been calling for changes in these areas to provide more housing and to provide food for people. There are many farmer groups and others that talk about how can we throw out a third of our food in this country when millions are hungry. You can do it. You can. But the last thing I want to do is get up and look at Twitter and see somebody blaming the government for not acting on poverty, when those people were in government not all that long ago and poverty mushroomed. So, come on, let's just be honest about it. It's a political tool. It looks great. It might work, but it's long in the tooth now. It's been far too long. And we're watching our kids struggle as they go through this. It's one thing to be without food. It's another thing to not have money to go on school trips. It's another thing to not be able to have a secure roof over your head. Just do it. Just do it. The country will thank you if you can show that kind of leadership, that you will work with anybody to help our kids to have full stomachs. You can do that. Now, in the past, that has not happened, and even we as Canadians have sometimes gotten very selfish. We want our taxes so lowered that it cuts into the marrow of our kids' lives. But we're learning. The pandemic has taught us, and in life since, the rising inflation, everything else, has taught us there's a cost to our negligence, and we're paying some of those things now. Mr. Poilievre, don't. Just don't. Put out your policies, do whatever you're going to do. But please don't use the people that are coming to food banks. And in London, it's 6,000 families a month and an equivalent amount that we're helping elsewhere. Please don't use them as your tools for trying to gain power. Use them as your proof that you can better their condition. And once that happens, prove it. And you're not going to be able to come up with your own solution. Once you work with all parties to develop this solution, then you will prove that you are a leader. And I say the same to all the leaders of all the parties. But to keep voicing that it's really too bad that we've got so many people that are hungry in this country, and it's their fault, these other parties, is to cheapen the lives and the struggles of those who are trying to make ends meet. Just do it. Please. Just do it. Now that we have seen that hunger, poverty, and homelessness have been challenges that took decades to grab the national attention, we are still stuck with the same question. How could all this happen in a country as wealthy as Canada? The answer is complex, as are the problems. In an era of free trade and globalization, Canadians in general delighted in acquiring products from around the world in stores or online. We failed to take serious note of wages stagnating and other subtle changes to our economy that were also happening in the rest of the world. And we also failed to realize how the reduction in social assistance programs designed to help those in need have affected the country. We understood that social problems were growing, but were preoccupied with our own lives. Governments at all levels share much of the blame for what has happened. The three jurisdictions, local, provincial, and national, grew further apart during these years, leaving cities to deal with the bulk of the problems. In Ontario, as an example, the social assistance programs, Ontario Disability and Ontario Works, had their premiums frozen for over a decade. It resulted in struggling citizens and their families falling farther behind. Senior pensions failed to keep up with the standard of living, especially following COVID. Food banks across the country suddenly noticed significant increases in senior poverty and food insecurity. So what were some of the key causes of hunger and the rising sense of poverty that got us to this place in the last 20 years? Housing prices have increased dramatically in major urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver and here in London. This has led to an affordability crisis, pushing more people towards renting while rental prices have skyrocketed, making it difficult for lower income individuals to afford shelter. And then there's the lack of affordable housing. This hasn't kept up with demand, partly due to underinvestment in social housing and growing population pressures. And what about work? What about stagnant wages? Despite the cost of living rising significantly, wages never kept pace. Many people, and especially in low-paying sectors, struggle to meet basic needs despite being employed. And then there's income inequality. There's been a growing sense of this, with the wealthiest Canadians seeing significant income growth, while the lower and middle income groups have seen their real earnings stagnate. The increasing number of Canadians who are employed in part-time and contract positions without job security, paid sick leave, or sufficient benefits also adds to this national precarity. And then, of course, is the one we all understand, the rising cost of living. Food prices have increased due to factors like supply chain disruptions, climate change, and global economic instability. This has resulted in greater food insecurity for many families. Costs associated with utilities, transportation, and other necessities have also risen, which disproportionately affects lower income households. And then there's the underfunded mental health and addiction services. Insufficient investment in mental health services and addiction programs has contributed to homelessness, as many individuals lack the support needed to address these issues. And then, of course, what about the pandemic? It's left its fingerprints all over this. The pandemic led to widespread job losses, business closures, and reduced working hours, particularly affecting those in vulnerable industries such as hospitality, retail, and tourism. Food banks, shelters, and other support services have seen increased demand since the pandemic as more individuals and families have struggled financially. There's also the strain on services that come from rapid population growth. This is partly due to immigration, as this has put additional pressure on the housing market and social services. While immigration brings economic benefits, it has also contributed to increased competition for limited affordable housing and resources. Indigenous people in Canada experience higher rates of poverty and homelessness due to historic injustices, systemic discrimination, and a lack of adequate resources and opportunities. And there's also the problem of racialized communities. They're also more likely to face poverty and housing insecurity due to systemic barriers. They have trouble accessing employment, education, and social services. Addressing these issues requires a comprehensive approach that involves increasing the availability of affordable housing, improving social assistance, ensuring fair wages, and investing in mental health and addiction services, among many other measures. But none of these are happening to the degree that they must if we're to find a better future. So here we are in the middle of a nation that's got abundant wealth and abundant poverty and hunger that continues to grow. We've looked at all the different things that have gone into that, what's made that great contradiction that many of us struggle with. But also we have to sit down and figure out, what are we going to do about that? What are the things that must be addressed in order for us to be able to reverse this trend that we are now in, especially for the sake of our children? There's a lot of things we're going to consider, There's a lot of reasons why we're stuck. One of the ones, and maybe the prime one, is political dysfunction. We've talked about this earlier in the video, but when parties spend all of their time blaming one another, that doesn't help. We also have a province here in Ontario that has really refused to develop a more robust model of social assistance premiums for people who are on disability or people who are on Ontario Works. That has frozen them in place at the same time that the standard of living has gone way up and people just can't afford to keep going and purchase their own food. It's very difficult. But it's also due to civic governments as well. There are civic governments here in Canada that really push and support urban agriculture. London is not one of those cities. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for that. The reality is that we have a number of bylaws in place and other things that are stuck that, in spite of all the heavy efforts of groups in this city who work on issues like this and are trying to help the city to realize that in the middle of all of this growing land around London, we must begin the process of growing within London. The reason for that is that it brings down the cost of food because there's more availability. It opens up local markets. It provides fresher food that's nearer to us. And it also has great environmental advantage in doing that. We don't have to bring our stuff in from around the world. That's really important. And London City Council has been remiss in how it has addressed this problem. That's one of the things we're going to have to consider. But there's more. What are we going to do about the current situation in which so many Londoners actually can't afford food? Now, we see this all the time at the food bank, where it used to be just people on social assistance. Now it's people across the board, across the spectrum, who are coming to us and saying we cannot afford rent and food. So we're going to have to address that as well. Also, what about the kind of food that people get? We know there's all sorts of nutritious food in this region. We've talked about this earlier. And we also know that Southwest Ontario is envied around the world for its growth of nutritious food capacity. It has a tremendous advantage to that. And we've got farmers that have proved that over decades and decades. How are we going to address that? How do you address the fact that there's all these different groups in London that are really trying to say the same message? Develop an urban agriculture strategy, the way that places like Detroit has just down the road, or even in Toronto. We seem stuck in this time freeze in which we don't have this ability to be able to say, here's a dynamic thing that we can do to begin to put more food out into the system. That's an important aspect as well. And what are we going to do about our children? I've been working a lot on this just in the last month. But when any government, as Nelson Mandela said, any government or nation, its soul is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable, especially its children. Not its GDP, not its robustness, not its vastness, not its economy and how great it's doing. Its soul is measured by the fact that if kids are going hungry, then something is wrong with our soul. We need some kind of dealing with it in order to be able to change ourselves around. And that's what we have to do here. And it's important for that to happen. We have to take a good long look in the mirror and say, what are the things that have to be done? This series is going to be about how do we begin to reverse that process and bring more fresh food into London, lower the prices, become a food city, which we are not right now. We're still content with importing stuff from everywhere else when we have the capacity here to do amazing things. This series is going to look at that. It's important. It's important for our kids. It's important for us. But it's important for our civic leaders to understand, bring in all of these people that are interested and charge them with developing the kind of model we need. Is London a food city? No. Can it be? It will be.